I, 27-year-old male, have been acquainted with my situationship for more than 15 years now, which constitutes more than half of my lifetime. She was the recent entrant in middle school, and she possessed an aura of enchantment. Nikki, 27-year-old female, had an exceedingly troubled childhood that left deep scars, shaping her into a matured, emotionally detached individual with dyed blue hair and a distinctly punk wardrobe. She embodied everything I aspired to be, and I found her overwhelmingly impressive. You see, my father perished in action when I was at a tender age, and my mother never fully recuperated from the downward spiral it threw her into. In that state, she encountered my stepfather, an exceedingly irate man who harbored no fondness for me. My mother, unable to conceive more children, and he harbored bitterness at being saddled with just me. The abuse commenced gradually with minor smacks to the back of my head and occasional shoves. However, by the time I crossed paths with Nikki, it had escalated into severe beatings that my mother turned a blind eye to. He held sway over the local law enforcement, leaving me with little recourse. I learned that lesson the hard way. But Nikki was there to tend to my wounds inflicted by my stepfather. At the ages of 13 to 14, we would clandestinely slip out a few times a week to discuss our traumas while strolling along the deserted dirt roads of our quaint rural town. At 15 is when she started talking about having friends with benefits with guys in our class, and I was enthralled, seizing that opportunity to become her next. Nikki didn't have any positive views on relationships, and she didn't want one and made that clear over the years. I lied to her about doing it too, even though I was a virgin, and I have no regrets of her secretly taking my virginity. It didn't help my feelings for her in the slightest. It got worse. I hated seeing her interact with any guy knowing that they had seen her too, and reminding me that all those moments were only special to me. By the end of high school, it was overwhelming, and it was also apparent that she was going to college. I was not. To make matters worse, she chose an out-of-state college, and it was very apparent that we weren't going to see each other the same 4 to 5 times a week that we normally did. It was a bitter goodbye, and that was mostly my fault. Things just got worse for me after that, though. The moment I turned 18, my stepfather kicked me out with little protest from my mother. She was more like a zombie with all those pills anyways at that point. I spent a long time on the streets, couch surfing and taking from donation boxes to survive. When the weather turned cold, thankfully a little old church lady who had known my mother and father took pity on me and allowed me to stay in her barn loft in exchange for being the farmhand for the winter. It wasn't a 5-star hotel or anything, and I had to make do with what was already up there, as well as learning the ins and outs of the barn, but it gave me a sense of stability in a long time. I would end up staying there and working for her till I was 23. During the holidays, Nikki would return to spend time with her foster family. She visited me in my barn loft whenever she could, and things seemed normal until her second year when, out of nowhere, she announced she had a boyfriend. To say I was bitter would be an understatement, but I tried to handle it rationally when she visited. However, it became evident to her that I had some sort of issue, and we ended up in a heated argument. She accused me of being entitled and selfish for not being able to be happy for her, which infuriated me. The visit ended shortly after, and it wouldn't be until the following year, when my mother passed away unexpectedly, that I would see her again at the funeral. She was my rock during that time. I was a mess, turning to alcohol every chance and had no motivation or drive to do anything. She had broken up with her boyfriend at this time, and college had seemed to really change her. She was more docile almost, but still held her confidence. She genuinely tried her hardest to help me out during this time, but there was just a darkness in me that I couldn't overcome. One particular night after we had intimacy, I just looked her dead in the eyes and told her I couldn't love her, that she was wasting her time and energy with me. Our time back together made me realize that she had caught feelings for me, and while she kept it to herself, I could see it through her actions. When I went to hold her afterwards, when we were teens, she would always jerk away and get dressed as soon as possible. Now she let me hold her for as long as I wanted. It was small things like that which just made me angry instead of happy. She got tense after I said that, pulling away from me completely, and held herself instead, asking why. I hate myself for what I said next, and I regret it to this day. I brought up her body, criticizing how I could never love someone as larger and paler as her. It wasn't as if she was extremely overweight, but she had gained noticeable weight since starting college. As for her paleness, she fell on the albinism scale, so she always looked exceptionally light. When left undyed, her hair was actually a striking snow-white blonde, with no yellow pigment at all, and her eyes were a beautiful pale green. In reality, I had no issue with any of this. Instead of breaking down into tears, she called out my nonsense right then and there, labeling me a coward if that was truly the path I wanted to take. I yelled at her to leave, and by then tears were welling in her eyes. I'm pretty sure the only reason she left was to spare me from seeing her cry. It took several days of wallowing and self-pity for me to realize what I had just thrown away. I tried to reach out to her, but she had blocked me on every platform. It unnerved me not to have any means of contacting her for the first time since middle school, and I spiraled even further into despair. The next year, the kind old church lady passed away, and I found myself homeless again as her family reclaimed the house and didn't want a dirty, depressed 23-year-old stranger living in their barn loft. It took a long time and many failed suicide attempts before I met my sponsor, Dan. Dan truly saved me. He provided shelter, food, water, therapy, and even taught me a job that I became quite skilled at. I started saving up and soon bought my first truck, then rented my first house. I slowly quit drinking after being diagnosed with BPD like my mother, and I fell into a routine of taking my medication properly. I even got my first dog, a little brown pit bull named Juno, whom I spoil rotten. I talked a lot about Nikki with my therapist, who believed we were trauma bonded and that I had developed an unhealthy attachment to her as she had been the only positive in my life. Long story short, I knew I owed her an apology, but I remained blocked on all her social media accounts and genuinely had no idea where she was after she graduated. It wasn't until 3 years later that I finally had the opportunity, and it changed my whole life. Our small town hosts a farmer's market that I enjoy taking Juno to. She's friendly and loves to play with the other dogs and children who run around. Since I can't afford another dog right now, we take playdates and socialization wherever we can get it. Juno was off-leash, playing with a group of children when I spotted a whitehead in the crowd. They were asking me all sorts of questions about Juno, and I was doing my best to answer them, which distracted me momentarily. Then suddenly, she was right in my face, and I was looking into hauntingly familiar pale green eyes. It made me dizzy as she asked if Juno could play with a stick she had found, and I could only nod. Once the kids ran off, I kept an eye out, and my suspicions were confirmed. There she was, picking out produce. Her hair, under a bandana, was back to its striking white, and she had a baby on her hip, who couldn't have been more than a year old, matching both her and the little girl. She was walking and talking with her foster mom, wearing a blouse and a long patterned skirt. Nothing like her spikes and chains from middle and high school. She had put on some more weight, but she didn't look unhealthy. Her eye bags were still dark, but she looked happier. She was beautiful, and a wave of guilt washed over me for how things had ended. But even if she never wanted to see me again, I knew she deserved closure. She looked as if she had seen a ghost when she saw me, but quickly hid her expression and began putting her walls up again immediately, which broke my heart, but was what I expected. Her foster mother took the baby away so we could talk in private, and I watched as she resorted to holding herself again. Looking down, I managed to get her to look me in the eyes and spilled out how sorry I was, how much I've improved, and how far I've come now. Her expression softened a bit when I mentioned therapy and how much I've learned about myself from it. We stared at each other in silence for a long time before she accepted my apology and let me hug her. We laughed and cried a little, but before we got too emotional in the middle of a crowded farmer's market, I changed the subject to catching up and asked if she had settled down, referring to the children. She answered no, explaining that she had taken in her two young half-siblings after her mother lost custody of them to CPS. She hadn't talked much about her mother or her past when we were growing up, at least not the full extent of it, and there was a familiarity in the way she spoke about her mom now that indicated they were still not on good terms. Her sister was 6 years old, and her brother was just under a year old, as I had suspected. But as always, I could tell she was holding something back, and I didn't press. I wanted her to meet Juno and called her over from the group of kids she had been entertaining. She called her sister back as well, but to my surprise, she called out 2 names. Juno came running, with Nikki's sister behind her, holding the hand of a younger girl I hadn't noticed before because I had been distracted by Nikki's white hair, but now I couldn't look away. The girl was an older toddler with ginger hair and light brown eyes, but those freckles, that darker skin color, the shape of her nose and eyes, that was all me. It was like someone had made a mini female clone of me and slightly changed the hair and eye color. I was speechless, to say the least. She ran right into her mother's arms, and we all just stared at each other, while Nikki's sister obliviously kept playing with Juno. I didn't know what to do or say, and when her foster mother returned, she asked me to come back to their house with them so they could explain. I loaded Juno up and followed them back to their old ranch house, but honestly, I was on autopilot, still in shock. The girls were overjoyed to play with the puppy longer, and they did so in the backyard while Nikki and I watched them from the porch, her brother dozing off in her arms. She explained that she didn't even know she was pregnant until the last few months before she gave birth. During that time, I had gone silent with all our mutual friends, and she didn't even know if I was alive or dead for the first 2 years. That's when I was struggling with suicidal thoughts and felt like my whole world was over. Eventually, as I started to get better, she found out where I lived and debated on telling me, but she had been living out of state. When she got custody of her siblings, issues arose, and she had to move back in with her foster family. She had only been back a few weeks and hadn't really prepared herself on what she was going to say to me, but she wasn't sorry for having her daughter, no matter how I felt, and she can and will do just fine raising her on her own, if it comes to that. It took a long time for the shock to wear off, but when it finally did, I told her I really wanted to be in my daughter's life. There was some initial anger that she kept this from me for so long, but I couldn't blame her. It had been impossible to get a hold of me at that time, and she was under the impression that I hated her. That anger turned to sadness and so much regret for how badly I treated her because of how we were as teens, how much I already missed out on in my daughter's life, and what she had to go through alone. It's been a year now, and I can honestly say things have changed for the better. We're not romantically involved, though both of us refuse to see other people. I definitely have feelings for her once again, but I'm willing to wait for however long she needs. I love my daughter so much. I didn't think I could ever love something as much as Juno, but her smile could make my whole week. Honestly, I love Nikki's siblings too. Her sister is funny, loves animals, and is extremely gentle and loving with my daughter. Her brother is like a son to me almost. He had some developmental issues, so his first word was really late, but I was there to witness it, and both me and Nikki were in hysterics. We celebrated with a nice dinner, and I teasingly called it a date. While she rolled her eyes and denied it, she just couldn't stop smiling. A few months in, she told me that as the father of her child, I at least needed to know some of her family history. It turned out she was one of a couple of dozen children pulled from a cult compound that was raided by the government. She described the hardcore drug abuse all of the adults, including her mother, were engaged in every day, and the bizarre rituals that were really just forms of abuse and assault that they were forced to endure. She explained how they were never taught anything about the real world and were kept in this sadistic bubble for the first 10 years of her life. Her real name wasn't even Nikki. In fact, neither of her siblings' names were truly what she had said they were either. They all had long and strange masculine Bible names regardless of gender. And while her name was changed for privacy reasons, she made the decision to change them completely. Her sister was named after her favorite Disney princess, which I had always seen as a coincidence, but knowing that she got to pick out her own name, it made a lot more sense. She talked about how many people escaped during the raid, including her mother, and how in another state they had attempted to restart the cult, only to be caught again. She was notified of the existence of her siblings, and it scared her to think of what could have been happening to them, whether in the cult or in foster care. This wasn't her first foster family, and I knew she had severe trauma from the other ones, so she had to take them. It was a lot to take in, and part of me didn't want to believe her, but she showed me old birth certificates, records of the incident, and even videos retrieved from the raid where you could see her distinctive white hair among sickly, dirty kids in raggedy clothes, doing very strange and horrifying things with the adults praising them. I didn't watch much of it, but it was still enough to make me feel sick and angry. The thought of those things happening to her and her siblings was heartbreaking. I made a promise right then and there that as long as I was breathing, nothing would ever happen to her or those kids again. I held her and her brother for hours after that, and when her sister and our daughter came looking for us, I held them close too. That night, she kissed me. That night, it was the only time so far, but it was enough to give me hope for our future. If you had told me 4 years ago that I would become part of a family of 5 with my situationship, I wouldn't have believed you in the slightest. I thought my life had no meaning or value left, but now I wouldn't trade anything for where I am. My life is full of love I never thought I was worthy of. Nikki gave me permission to share this much and only this much, so please feel free to ask for more details. Thanks for listening to me.